You're like, public meeting of the Voter Assistance Advisory Committee. Let's begin with the approval of the minutes from February 13th, 2008. Is there a motion to approve? All in favor? All opposed? Motion carries. Okay, and now to the report of the Voter Assistance Advisory Committee Chair. And that is me. Oh, okay. So hello, and thank you for joining us this evening at the New York City Voter Assistance Advisory Committee's biannual public hearing. I'm Naomi Zauderer, and I'm a member of the New York City Campaign Finance Board and chair of the Voter Assistance Advisory Committee. Today we'll start by discussing key findings from the recently released 2017 to 18 Voter Assistance Annual Report, and then we'll open the floor for members of the public to provide their own testimony regarding their experiences in 2017 elections. In this annual report, we take a look back at the various initiatives undertaken by this committee and the NYC Votes team to encourage more New Yorkers to participate in city elections. Reviewing the results of the 2017 elections, there's some good news. For the first time in decades, voter turnout did not decrease from the previous mayoral election. But the bad news is that voter turnout didn't increase significantly either. Despite all of the increased interest in voting and protecting our democracy at the national level, only 1 in 5 eligible city voters cast a ballot for mayor. That's not a reason to despair. Instead, for all of us in New York City who care about our democracy, results from 2017 are proof that we need to buckle down and work even harder. I believe, and I think that the other members of this committee agree with me, that the place to start is with changing our state voting laws. It is clear that after decades of sustained partisan gridlock in Albany, we have an outdated election system that suppresses participation rather than encouraging it. New York's long-standing barriers to the ballot must come down for good. If we want elections that put the needs of voters first, we need to make ourselves heard. It's time for the legislature to follow the example of 37 other states and make early voting a reality in New York. Limiting elections to a single high-stakes 15-hour day in the middle of the work week does not fit with modern life. It contributes to local elections that are decided by a small fraction of eligible voters. Early voting will help ensure more New Yorkers can cast votes. We need to fix our voter registration system and remove the obstacles that keep hundreds of thousands of eligible New Yorkers off the voter rolls. And we need to ensure no voter can have his or her essential rights undermined or violated. We urge you to join in this effort and lend your voice to our call for reform. Take some time to talk with your neighbors about community issues. Make sure your family members are registered to vote. Go see your government at work by attending a community board meeting, a council hearing, or a participatory budgeting event. Create the city you want with your voice and your vote. Putting these words of encouragement into action, NYC Votes is leading a coalition of community groups to meet with lawmakers next week on Tuesday, May 8th. We'll be advocating for a platform of voting rights legislation, including early voting, same-day registration, and much more. For more information and to get involved with this effort, visit votebetterny.org, where you can also sign a petition in support of these measures. I now turn to Amy Lopres, the Executive Director of the New York City Campaign Finance Board, for her report.
Thank you. I only have a very brief report. I want to, again, point out our beautiful voter assistance report, and I want to thank the staff who worked on it so hard. They're listed in the report, but I want to, and there are too many to really read all the names, but I want to, in particular, point out our lead writer and editor, Gina Tung, who is our production editor here at the Campaign Finance Board, who really shepherded this whole project through. So thank you very much. It's a lovely report and a lot of very interesting facts and information about voting in New York City. So I encourage everyone to read through it. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to testify before the Illinois State House of Representatives regarding a bill that they're considering that to create a small dollar matching funds program in Illinois based on the New York City program. As a matter of fact, it's so based on it, whole sections of our statute are right in their proposed bill. I was able to provide some expert testimony about a program, a matching funds program that has worked for 30 years. And so that was a great honor. And I look forward to hearing what happens with that bill. It had already passed the Illinois State Senate, a similar bill. So now I turn to Onita Karameres, the Director of Voter Assistance, for her report.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming out to the meeting today. I would like to first talk about Student Voter Registration Day. So on May 21st, New York City Votes is partnering with City Hall, the Department of Education, the Board of Elections, the City Council, and the New York Immigration Coalition to conduct Student Voter Registration Day. And this year will be in every single New York City public high school. So we're extremely excited about that. A lot of preparation going on back here at the office for it. Some of the things that we are doing in our role is that we are granting funds to community-based organizations who will facilitate SVRD in 12 of the city's largest high schools, public high schools. We're working with additional community-based organizations who will facilitate SVRD in 12 more schools on a pro bono basis. I think we have a couple of them in the room right now. If you could raise your hand. I think I see Dominicanos USA and Live On New York. Thank you very much. These are two of our awardees. We are supplying the schools with SVRD banners, pins, I registered to vote stickers, and civic engagement pledges for 450 schools. NYC Votes, working with City Hall and DOE, also produce the resource guide and all of the training materials that will be used for facilitators. We will host trainings in this very room, about 3 of them. And we will be then receiving all of the completed voter registration forms from May 21st to May 24th. So that's pretty much a big deal because we're hoping that we're going to get upwards of at least 15,000 voter registration forms. So processing of them is something that the staff here is going to be doing. And we are hoping to deliver those by May 25th to the Board of Elections, because of course the deadline is June 1st. So it's critical that they have enough time to do that. Of course, this effort is being led by Summer Griffin, our youth voter coordinator. So I'm happy that she's here with us this evening as well. And all members of our PA team, public affairs team. On to Voter Day. You heard a little bit about it. Sabrina Castillo, who is here, is leading that effort internally for us. We have a total of 4 buses right now going to Albany, representing a total of 22 organizations. The day will include a press rally with leads from the Assembly and the Senate legislature, along with selected partners who will be speaking. And then we have already scheduled 37 meetings with the legislators, and training for that was already held on April 28th. So while I said Sabrina Castillo has been leading it, we have a lot of other really strong partners. Katie, who is here, Amanda, who is here. So these are some of the members of the team who are also leading this effort. And then on to Local Law 29, our interagency partnerships. So Matthew George Pitt, who is new to our team, Matthew is in the back. The local law was passed to help New York City agencies to develop voter registration plans to make sure that they distribute voter forms in all their public-facing offices. In order to do this, you can imagine there's a lot of turnover in staff. So Matthew, over the last week and a half, trained 22 out of 26 agencies, which was a total of 78 people. So thank you very much, Matthew, for that. And then lastly, I would say that we all know the charter revision hearings have started, and designated staff and members of our team are attending the meetings and sharing notes. The next meeting, if anyone is interested in attending, is in Queens, the Queens Library in Flushing. That's tomorrow. Monday, May 7th is in Brooklyn at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, and Wednesday, May 9th at the New York Public Library. Now, I know Amy said this already, but you know, it's so good. You got to say it twice. So nice that you got to say it twice, as they would say. So I just want to show you again this report this year. And I want to really just ask those people who worked on it if they would please stand, because Crystal, Gina, Katie, Amanda, and all those people who have worked throughout the year with the programming, I really would like to recognize them, because we have come a long way. There's amazing. So thank you all very much. And that concludes my report.
I have a question.
Yes.
At the last meeting, there was a motion made that was carried that the committee write a letter to the Census Bureau about the inclusion of the citizenship question. And I was wondering, did it happen?
It surely did. Amy, would you like
We
to?
actually got a response. I had sent a copy of the letter and the response to everyone, but I can send it again in case people didn't get
Thank
it.
you.
Yeah, I mean, obviously
you
not a positive response, but because it was received on the it was very lovely letter from the Secretary of Commerce, but saying we're still including the question. It happened to actually come the day that they certified the questions to the Congress, so I knew that there was no chance, but I will send both of those again.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Are people familiar with the issue? That general, okay.
Well, you can repeat it.
Sure. So for those who may not know or may be watching online, the Voter Assistance Advisory Committee wrote a letter to the U.S. Department of Commerce, which is responsible for the census, which will be coming up. As you may know, the U.S. Constitution requires that every 10 years that people be counted. It says people, it doesn't say citizens. And New York has historically been undercounted, and the implications of this are manifest through not just apportionment, which is the level of representation, how districts are drawn eventually, but also when it comes to federal funding and formulas when it comes to resources. So it has a lot of consequences. And the commission, under our chair, submitted a letter to the Department of Commerce expressing our concerns.
Thank you. And with that, I will turn it over to our panel on the future of electoral reform. Where are we now post-budget? With speakers Perry Grossman from the NYCLU, Alex Camarda from reInvent Albany, and Esmeralda Simmons Esquire from the Center for Law and Social Justice.
And our Assistant Executive Director of Public Affairs, Eric Friedman, is going to be moderating that panel. We will open it to public comment. I understand that there's not anyone who has actually officially signed up to give public comment, but we will have public comment after the panel is completed. So we're going to switch up some.
We're going to do right now.
Yes, we're going to sit there and we're going to let the panelists sit here so they can be seen on the screen.
Oh, you.
All right, we all set? So again, thanks everyone for being here. As we discussed a few minutes ago, we are, and our volunteers are getting ready to travel to Albany next week for our 5th annual Voter Day lobbying effort to press our state legislators for meaningful election reform, which makes this discussion about where we go from here with 6 weeks to go, 7 weeks to go before the legislature wraps up its work. Especially timely. So we have 3 very distinguished guests here who can each provide kind of a unique perspective on these questions we're going to talk about. So just a little bit about each of them. So I'll start down at the end with Perry. He's the senior staff attorney at the Voting Rights Project at the New York Civil Liberties Union, where he focuses on litigation and advocacy efforts concerning voting rights and election law issues. Esmeralda Simmons is the founding executive director of the Center for Law and Social Justice, a community-based legal institution based at Medgar Evers College, which conducts racial justice legal and public policy campaigns. She specializes in racial justice issues such as voting rights, educational inequity, and human rights violations in the U.S., and she's led many major impact legal victories, including for voting rights and fair redistricting. And closest to me, Alex Camarda is senior policy advisor at reInvent Albany. As a senior staffer at the New York State Senate, Department of Finance here in New York City, and previously at Citizens Union, Alex has garnered deep practical experience in how government works and does not work, and has led numerous successful campaigns for cleaner and more effective government. Alex is an expert on campaign finance and election laws and enforcement. So again, thank you all for being here. This is going to be, I think, a really interesting discussion for us to have at this moment in time. So let me dive right into it, and I hope to leave a few minutes at the end. I'm going to start with a couple of high-level questions to frame the discussion, but I hope to leave it open for folks at the end if you want to jump in with questions of your own. So just first, we have the situation in Albany is kind of changing every week. For those of us, interested in election reform, it feels a little bit like Charlie Brown with football. We get this promise of progress at the start of the year, but Albany finds a way to yank that ball away before they get done. So what is the next step for those of us who think that we need dramatic changes in state election law to make voting easier?
I'm going to grab it.
Go ahead.
I'll grab it. There's no...
Right, so yeah, you want to put, yeah.
Okay. There's no magic bullet. I've been to Albany already with various voter advocacy groups 3 times, not counting prior to February, all focusing on packages very similar to what VAAC is pushing at this point, particularly early voting and either automatic voter registration or then I'm just going over a little bit of the football situation. Then we got statements from the governor. We got statements from the assembly. We got statements from the Senate Democrats that they were all in favor. We pushed harder. We got an item in the budget first time. And then the budget went on and it was dropped. However, we didn't drop the issue. So we're pressing forward. As I said, there's no magic bullet. This is really going to be about how hard we push and what buttons we press. And I think I don't mind saying, I think there's going to be a little bit of movement different this time. It might just be dancing, or never quite getting to the end line, particularly in the Senate. All eyes are on the Senate now to see if, in fact, certain Senate members who have promised to deliver this will, in fact, deliver it. But that doesn't mean that we don't have to be up there and pressing. If we, even for a week, don't have folks up there talking about voting rights, it will very easily slip through the cracks. So I believe it is definitely advocacy. It is going to Albany or going to your legislative offices locally. It's not a downstate issue only, and they would like to make it a downstate issue only. So moving with our colleagues upstate and going in uniform helps a lot. And finally, telling people to tell folks that their next vote, either in September or November, might hinge on how this goes down. Now, that shouldn't be an empty threat, folks, so we really do have to, as the report said, we actually have to come out and vote for somebody, not simply say we're not going to vote.
So I think the prospects for election reform in Albany this year are pretty grim, as is the case that Eric alluded to, as is true most years, unfortunately. I mean, I do think that the Let New York Vote coalition and others who are advocating for the issue have certainly amplified it and elevated it in a way that has not been true in past years. And I think they can take a lot of credit for that, particularly because the governor did act on the issue of parolee voting. So there was a victory, even though it was via executive order. I don't think anything's going to happen in terms of legislation. Eric described the Charlie Brown scenario. For me, it's like the movie Groundhog Day. It's the same thing over and over. This is a nonpartisan event. Reinvent Albany is a nonpartisan organization, but I really don't think that the Senate Republicans are going to enact the types of voting reforms that many advocacy groups have advocated for years. And I think that's primarily because I believe they think it's an existential threat to the Republican majority in the state Senate. The registration in New York State is about 2-to-1 Democrat to Republican. And as a result, their majority has long been precarious, and they've held on to it for a very long time. And I think their perception is that at least some of the reforms that the advocates are advocating for imperils their ability to keep the majority. That said, we may find out if the Democrats do, in fact, take the state Senate, as some believe they may, that there are a number of reforms that the Assembly will not do when it comes to voting, and those aren't talked about very much. But there's actually a whole list of them. The Assembly's never passed instant runoff voting, for example. They don't favor initiative or referendum. They don't favor filling vacancies for the comptroller or the attorney general via a vote rather than a selection by the Assembly, and the list goes on. So it's just because I think the focus has been on things like early voting and same-day registration and so forth, that the Senate is often seen as the barrier. But if the body becomes entirely Democratic, I think that tune may change.
I think they said it pretty well. I've always been sort of confused why Republicans don't like early voting and don't like measures to expand voter registration. It's not Republicans that have trouble turning out people to vote in New York. It's not Democrats that have trouble turning out people to vote. We hold every statewide office. Democrats hold, a vast majority of the Assembly, and Republicans seem to have difficulty even making a serious play for statewide office. So they should want things that make it easier for people to register and to vote. But for whatever reason, we've run up against those barriers, and I share the opinion of Esmeralda and Alex that things are a little bit grim. I think there's still a little bit of space to get early voting done. It's just too common sense. 38 states and DC do it. That we don't is an embarrassment. Frankly, the thing that should really pass just as a matter of good government is electronic poll books, right? This is the craziest thing in the world that we don't have electronic poll books in 2018. But I am firmly of the belief at this point that rather than waiting for Albany, it is imperative that New York City move forward and start to do things that lead this state on things that we have traditionally said that Albany should do, like electronic poll books, like certain kinds of electronic voter registration, like early voting. If Albany is not going to get the job done, then it is incumbent upon the city to do the job better and to force the Board of Elections to do the job better. And if they won't, then that's why we have a court system.
Well said. So I do want to get to some of the things we can do in New York City here. But Perry, you mentioned early voting. Alex, I think you guys have mentioned some other issues. What at the state level? What is the most important, the single biggest issue, the most important change we can make? If we could go to Albany next week and said we have one thing for you, what should that one thing be? What should it be?
It's been this year. It's been with the Let New York Vote Coalition, which the center is a proud member of, along led by Common Cause. It has been early voting, to the point where they see you coming and they say early voting. So that's been the push. The fact that we have narrowed the focus has helped, because I'm as guilty as any other advocate of going in with a list like this. When I lobbied with the NAACP, we had a list that was a little longer than that, and some people tried to hide behind the other measures. So I think bulleting is a good way of getting the attention. But my opinion as someone who's dealt with the Board of Elections for 50 years now, I believe New York State and New York City can't just do anything. New York's, because of the election law, that New York State election law, the entire system, the way it's set up, is a recipe for lack of participation. Particularly the fact that it's set up with competing interests governing one agency, and that is the two leading parties, both having staff and supposedly agreeing with every step going forward. But what we see is one step forward, one step back, one step forward, one step back. And for the most part, the state board of elections, in addition to the city board of elections, in addition to the board of elections in the city of New York, which is not a city agency, simply being held in hammerlocks and gridlock because they cannot get agreements amongst themselves. So even something as simple as, and I'm taking it a little bit away from our current topic, even something as simple as stating whether or not there were an erroneous purge 2 years ago, 100,000 voters, they couldn't quite agree on making a statement about that. Nor could they agree on making a statement about whether New York State and New York City was hacked in the last presidential election. So that sort of thing leads us all to the starting line. We never get out the box, and it's quite difficult. I'm agreeing that I would like New York City to do things, and the thing that I want New York City to do the most is to, might sound like a commercial, is to vamp up the voter assistance committee. That's what I want. That's what I want. I have seen more work coming out of this commission since it was started, and particularly in the last, I'd say, 5 years, than we had in decades before in terms of getting the word out. Not just the books are great in terms of the election guide, but more particularly going street to street, school to school, or community boards, etc., getting out and letting people know that they can do this, what the deadlines are, so that people are no longer in the New York City election law fog.
Yeah, I would echo that. I should have started my comments by saying I read this yesterday in preparation for this hearing, and I thought it was terrific. And there was data in this report that I've actually never seen before for New York City, and I really think it speaks to the work of the VAAC. And I think it was a couple of years ago the Charter Revision Commission, in its wisdom, put the VAAC inside the CFB, and I think this report, which illustrates all the work that's been done, is a testament to the success of the VAAC. And I think the VAAC has probably done more to improve voter engagement and stem the tide of voter participation that was declining maybe than any other governmental entity. So I congratulate you on your work.
It's significant, folks. It's very significant.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
So I'm going to join in and say that this is my favorite city agency, and what you guys do is really.
I just want to make it clear, I have not supplied the speakers with talking points.
No, this is true. Because the data, look, the data is what we need to make progress. We make evidence-based decisions. We push public policy. At least we're supposed to push public policy based on evidence. And so to have data like this means everything. I'm going to disagree with a whole bunch of stuff Esmeralda said, though, even though I think she's right about virtually everything in the world. Early voting is the big ticket item, right? And like I said, it's an embarrassment that we don't have it. Electronic poll books are really sort of the linchpin of progress. It's much easier to get early voting done if you have electronic poll books. It's easier to get same-day registration done if you have electronic poll books. It's easier to comply with the National Voter Registration Act if you have. I mean, there is literally nothing that is not easier if you don't have electronic poll books. Now, the thing I'm going to disagree with Esmeralda about is the extent to which the New York State election law is and should be a constraint on New York City and the New York City Board of Elections. There is a higher law, of course, than the New York election law, which is the New York State Constitution. The New York State Constitution, Article 2, Section 1, provides a right to vote to every person over the age of 18. I can't remember if there's a qualification there, but that is your express constitutional right to vote. It is not found in the federal Constitution. It is found right there. And if you look at the first words of the Bill of Rights of the New York State Constitution, it says, I think no citizen of this state shall be disenfranchised, no member of this state shall be disenfranchised, right? There are ways in which elections are being administered in New York State right now that are violating those two constitutional provisions. They are depriving people of the right to vote. And the New York State election law cannot and should not be read in a way that deprives people of their state constitutional right to vote. And so, I realize we talk about things like electronic poll books as a statutory matter, and you can read the election law in a very, very restrictive way to suggest that you need state legislative action in order to implement what is really a very common sense election administration practice. I think this is the thing that could be done right now. We have the technology to do it. We have the funding to do it. There is no reason that electronic poll books should not be used immediately in New York City elections. And I think there are other things that could be done as well. And I think to the extent that the City Board of Elections or anyone else wants to stand in the way of New York City making those critical reforms, those are violations of the state constitution, and the city can and should be prepared to enforce them in court.
So I would say in response to my colleagues here, Eric did ask what's the one issue that you think could transform voting in New York State. And I would actually say that none of the issues on before us, because they're really all common sense reforms that have been done elsewhere, whether it's early voting or electronic poll books, are actually revolutionary in changing voter participation. I think they would improve voter participation. Unfortunately, the legislature sees them as a bit revolutionary, but they're really not. You really have to look out west to other states to see really innovative ideas that are going on. For example, I think North Dakota has no voter registration whatsoever, which is an interesting concept that I think should be looked at. You have states like Oregon, Washington, Colorado do their entire elections are done by mail. So nobody even goes to a poll site. They don't have any of the expenses, which in New York are tens of millions of dollars to administer elections on election day. So I think some of those are the more interesting issues. California has top two nonpartisan elections where essentially you have all voters voting in the first and second rounds. And there's, it goes beyond open party primaries where you really don't have party primaries at all. The candidates have a designation that indicates what party they're affiliated with. 80% of municipalities have nonpartisan elections. Most of the cities in the Northeast, including New York City, have resisted that for a long time now. I think that those are much more revolutionary in bringing in more voters than anything else. For example, nonpartisan elections in New York City, is cited in this book. There's 4.5 million registrants in New York City, but only 3 million of them are in a party. So right off, you have 1.5 million people who could potentially participate in the first round of voting. I think that is far more dramatic than, say, incremental gains from early voting, same-day registration, things like that.
Sure.
So I think there is an important so I agree with a lot of what Alex just said. I think there's an important bottleneck that prevents any of that sort of revolutionary thinking from taking place. And I will admit that I'm stealing this idea from an unnamed wise person in the room. But the chief impediment to that sort of revolutionary thinking is the fact that we have elections administered by a party duopoly and not by professional election administrators, right? And there are self-dealing interests that reign rather than, ultimate, what is the way in which we can fulfill the critical fundamental goal of ensuring that every eligible citizen who wants to cast a ballot is able to cast a ballot. And so I think that, I think Esmeralda and I, in my first answer, were thinking more in the realms of what can we do this year? What's still on the table? What if we push hard enough? Can we make happen? And, early voting, electronic poll books, that sort of thing. But if we want to think in a big way, I think if we were to professionalize election administration, take the parties out of the business of administering that, then we can start to explore the kind of revolutionary ideas that do pump up registration and turnout, or non-registration, in the case of the Dakotas, in a really meaningful way.
I do want to point out that the most significant fact in the fantastic report was that the issue, though the issue of registration is crucial, the real downturn comes with the lack of retention. I'm talking about retention, repeat voters. So when you have a fall off, 50% fall off, those of us that work at CUNY, we talk about retention of students a lot. But here, it's about retention of voters. And part of the problem, I believe, and every day somebody comes in to talk about voting, and I have to let people know simple things. This might sound crazy to you in the room. Simple things like you don't have to register every year. That if you want to vote, you simply have to show up. You don't need a card or an ID, unless this is the exception. And that while some of the communication that has gone out has been extremely effective in getting new registrants, what we haven't been doing, in my opinion, is targeting existing registrants by letting them know that if you haven't voted in 5 years, you can still go and vote. Letting them know that the time for them to get ready to decide to vote is coming up, in addition to the voter's guide, and that they need to start paying attention to what is happening because the election is coming. In other words, we need to get as savvy as some of the younger folks are. We may not want to be like some high-level official and be tweeting every day, but we need to get into the repetitious reminder about election, and also a reminder that if you don't like the way things are going, vote. Here's your opportunity. So I think that is something that has to be paid attention to. In addition to the youth vote, you're doing a great job of getting immigrants who are newly naturalized registered, but it's not just the registration, that one-time thing, as you say in the report. It is more hounding into people that elections occur every year. It's not every 4 years. And your garbage collection is not determined by who's the president of the United States.
No, I think that's right.
Alternate side of the street parking.
Well, I think it's right that providing information to people is one of the I think the most important things that we can do to help people feel closer to their local elections. Is something that we do a lot of. I'm curious. I want to open it up though. Like when we're talking about voter turnout in New York City, this last election, when we elected the guy who does pick up the trash and clean the streets, 1 in 5 people came out to vote. 1 in 5 eligible voters came out to vote. We kind of held it steady from the last election, which is better than we expected, but it's still 1 in 5. So what else can we be doing, whether it's us at CFB, whether it's the advocates who care about the issue, what else can we be doing to get more people paying attention and getting them out to vote?
I think this report actually lays the groundwork as to what to do. I mean, I think the approach of the VAAC, where they initially did a focus group and asked people why they don't vote, and then some of the data that really sheds light on particular neighborhoods and what their turnout percentages are and their registration percentages, and noting that even when you might have a low registration percentage, you might have a high turnout. And then some of that was surprising to me, but clearly there are neighborhoods, like I noticed Belmont in the Bronx, where I used to teach high school social studies, has a very low registration rate, very low participation rate. And I think there are a number of neighborhoods like that where now VAAC can send in its teams that do the door knocks and the phone calls and really target these particular areas. And I think that will really help not only with registration but turnout, because now we have the information that enables the team to make targeted interventions. I also think what's important about the report that comes across is the use of technology. You really can't scale, at least I don't think the VAAC can, given their resources, can't scale in the way that you can scale with technology. I mean, I noticed in the person-to-person registration events and so forth, you're lucky if you get a couple thousand people a year. And when you're talking about using technology, whether it's viewing the YouTube station or the video voter guide, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who can access that information. So it's much larger and much more impactful. And I think I know the CFB is currently working on online voter registration. I know that we focused on that in part because we've thought, based on the experience at the DMV, that it was more impactful than anything else in terms of making it easier to register. And I think using technology for your campaigns, and it was a very expert campaign that was run to turn people out previously, can make a real difference, and probably did make a real difference in this last election.
So I do not do a lot of voter turnout work as part of my job, but it's my job to talk to a lot of people who do voter turnout work. And in all of the people who are significantly better at this than I am, I've picked up sort of two related lessons. And the first one is, if you want to engage people, whether it's, consumers, whether it's legislators you're trying to lobby, or whether it's voters you want to turn out, higher contact strategies are better, right? The more you can actually be in front of them and engage with them, the more likely they are to engage in the behavior you want them to engage in. The other thing that I've learned is, if you want people to do something, particularly people who turned out at 13.4% in the last election, but also 19.4%, and maybe even all the way up the scale, if you want people to do something and engage with it, make it cool. And that might be a challenge for the people in this room. I know it's a challenge for me. I haven't been cool for a very long time, if ever. But the way
we nerds are hip now.
That's right. We are a bunch of hardworking and well-meaning nerds, and right. But I think we are in an age where to steal another good idea, because all the best ideas should be stolen repeatedly, right? Especially now, I think good is the new cool, and political participation right now is good. There is an area for us to sort of build cool around civic participation, around voter turnout, because people, I think, are more engaged in sort of on a day-to-day with the news and with everything that's going on. And so, it's important to take advantage of the people who are great generators of cool, which is to say, artists and musicians and all these folks, these great creative content makers. Partner them with organizations that bring to the table a significant amount of credibility, like CFB, like the Commission, like the ACLU, so the point is find those partnerships where you can meld a good message with a cool one and turn that loose on voting. And I think there's a lot of very specific ways you can talk about that, but if you want to generate a lot of engagement, make it cool.
And Rock the Vote proves that.
and Rock the Vote is now 26 years old, right? So we've got to be innovating, right? The things that brought people out to vote for candidates 25 years ago are not the same things that are going to do it today.
They're so old, they're in danger of not being cool anymore.
Exactly. But everything that is old becomes new again. So, I feel like I'm on that very uncool sweet spot right now. But folks 10 and 20 years older and 10 and 20 years younger, they are in that sweet spot on the good side. So maybe they've got the answers.
That said, I think it's important to acknowledge that there are also like societal forces that are beyond the control of the VAAC or the CFP or any of our advocacy groups when it comes to citizen engagement and voter participation. I think it's very interesting that despite the fact that in the city, we have a campaign finance board with the VAAC that's doing voter outreach. We're a huge media market. There's more advocacy groups. There's certainly, it's the advertising capital of the world, or at least the United States. Even with all of that, the city's voter turnout is consistently less than upstate. And that's been true for a long, long time. And, I don't know of as many groups doing this kind of work upstate. There's certainly no VAAC in most of the governments upstate, and yet people are turning out more. So to me, that tells me that there are other factors going on, and I think maybe there's a greater sense of community upstate that doesn't exist in the city, and perhaps that's the reason that there's more of kind of an obligation or an interest in turning out. And I think that some of those issues, need to be looked at more. In talking to City Board of Elections commissioners, they've pointed me to a book called Bowling Alone, which is a book about, kind of as the world becomes more connected, the communities become more disconnected. And we certainly shouldn't use that as an excuse for not acting on our own and doing everything we can. But I think it would be foolish not to acknowledge that there's something there and looking more deeply at that.
So one group I talked to in the course of all this, just to take off where Alex sort of left us, is a group called Civic Nation. And this is just sort of one good idea, I think, sort of start to build the kind of community that results in higher turnout. Their idea was hashtag vote together, right? Make voting a social activity where you are throwing parties next to polling places, or in some cases in polling places. I think that's.
I don't know that you can do that here.
Right? No. Well, I don't know that you can do it either. But you could do it. You could throw your party as close as 100 feet away from a polling place, and by doing enough marketing behind it, and by making it an all day thing, they were seeing turnout bumps of 5 to 7%, and the idea that voting as a social activity, right? This is something, now, granted, it can be tough in a place where you've got a lot of political polarization, where maybe, Republican and the Democrat aren't necessarily getting excited about being in the same room on November 2020 or something like that. But, especially when it comes to local elections and places where you have a lot of community concerns that you have in common, you can see where having voting as a local social activity could draw people in. So I think ways that use elections to build a community experience, whether it's through throwing parties or whatever kind of events you want to do, that's been shown to increase turnout, and if done the right way, should be able to increase turnout even more than we've seen so far.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because my staff, we were discussing census and how to reach hard to reach younger people, and 3 times from 3 different people came up, well, maybe we need to have a wine and cheese, census social event to get people hyped up about what the census is. And I kept looking at the wine and I said, but they said no, that social now is how you get the information out, particularly to younger people, and they're not going to come. They're not like the talented 10th here. They're not going to come out to a community meeting or an agency meeting, but they would go to something at their local watering hole or somebody's house where they can sit around and talk about the election, what they're going to do. Are you registered? When's the deadline, etc.? Oh, here's this voter registration form. Are you going to check off a party? You know what that means? You know the spiel. But It's been mentioned more than once. That's not something we expect VAAC to do, but it's something that advocates can get a hold of and partner with local communities. I also wanted to go back to what can we do differently, because I'm just as guilty as everyone else as relying on myths and stereotypes I'm thinking about where we need to improve voter turnout, where we need to improve voter registration. And your fantastic report just smashes most of that, really smashes it, because most of you are probably not old enough to remember when New York City used to have, they actually would even call themselves precinct captains, district captains, who would go out and New York City was ethnically, it still is, ethnically located city. So while Little Italy may not be in Little Italy anymore, there's still, Italian, there's Orthodox Jew area, there's, let's see what's the best, Southern Indian, Southeast Asia, places around the city. So I looked at the voter turnout on your great page 43. And lo and behold, look who's not turning out. It is not Public Housing Authority residents. It is not Central Brooklyn. It's not Harlem. It's not the South Bronx. Yeah, folks, look at this. Williamsburg, Richmond Hill, North Corona, Bensonhurst. Well, you should be clicking this off now. If you combine census thinking with voter turnout, you are now looking at enclaves, basically European descendant enclaves that are not turning out. Now, some people will say, Williamsburg, oh, those are all the new hipsters. They're not all new hipsters anymore. But look at this. Fordham South, North Corona. Who would have thought 50 years ago that we would have problems with, where is it, Ridgewood? Who? The pastor gets up and says, go vote, everybody goes to vote. What's going on here? So there's been a breakdown. There's a classic African novel, Things Fall Apart. There's been a breakdown of community in these areas where there's no longer, we're all going out to vote for blank and blank person, and it's part of our responsibility. And we know that our parents and our forebears held this up, and we're going to hold this up. This is breaking down. It's almost breaking down somewhat along ethnic lines, and we need to take a real good look at that, because who we're sending where does make a difference in New York City.
Agreed. So before opening it up to the room, I have one more question for the group. I think each of you in different answers have talked about kind of the idea of needing to work with Board of Elections to implement change at the city level. We are on our own. Alex, you mentioned the online voter registration platform, which will require us to kind of work with them and try to find a way to mesh with their systems. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what are the next steps there, like in terms of, Perry, you talked a lot about the electronic poll books. How do we enlist them as kind of partners in this grand project, as opposed to I think the way we've been talking about them?
I mean, the Board of Elections is long been a tough challenge. I thought the mayor did something innovative by really offering them a much larger budget if they made certain changes and reforms. And they did not do that. They opted not to do it. I don't know if he should then turn to sticks or whether he really has any sticks, but I was surprised that the board did not take that opportunity for reform. I mean, there's so many levels of reform that the Board of Elections needs. I mean, there's kind of the statutory level, or just the structure where you have a bipartisan board, which only 2 states have in the country. Most, you have an elected Secretary of State, which has its own problems. If people want to think back to previous elections in Ohio and Florida before that, the Secretary of State model was frequently blamed. So I'm not sure that's even a solution. But clearly, too often the board structurally acts in either doing nothing because they can't agree, or a consensus, I think, to suppress enforcement, for example, when it comes to campaign finance enforcement. But even below the top structural level, it's widely regarded as a patronage mill, and the jobs, that always comes as a surprise to me, because the people who work at the board are actually terribly paid. There might be a lot of jobs there, but the pay is awful. And I really think the entire place needs to be professionalized. I worked at the Board of Elections once during Hurricane Sandy, when it was kind of an all hands on deck situation and they were looking for volunteers. And of course, this is, some time ago, but there were piles of paper on everyone's desk that was, literally this high. And most of the place was just people walking around bringing pieces of paper to different people. I mean, there's I think most of it was that, and absentee ballots and things like that. There was no digitization of anything. There was very little use of technology, considering this was 2012. So I think, the board alone can do a lot of that. I think the entire place needs to be professionalized. I think they need to pay people probably double the salaries they're paying, probably eliminate many positions, and do a lot more digitally with technology. Whether there's the political will for that, I highly doubt. But I think even doing that without changing the structure of the leadership would be a huge gain. I mean, even something as simple as they don't advertise positions that are open.
And leaders choose who goes in there.
They could advertise positions and see what candidates they receive and still select, the person that they would have selected otherwise. But they don't even do that to see if maybe there's somebody that would meet with their approval and actually be very well qualified. So these are all the things they should address, and there's probably many more that I haven't mentioned.
I actually have something positive to say about Board of Election practices, and I see one of my colleagues laughing. About 25 years ago, it was suggested that the Board of Election by a court order. That's the suggestion. When the censure sued the Board of Elections after 1988 and 1989 rather, and actually won a major injunction about how elections were supposed to be held in New York City in terms of the use of the old polling booths, and we created something called coordinators at the polling sites. Well, about 10 years ago, we made a formal recommendation that they equip the coordinators with iPads, so they could actually look into what was happening regarding somebody's voter registration, the same way you and I can. I do it from my office. I just go look them up, see whether you're registered or not. I mean, they weren't doing that. They would just they'd send people around to different polling sites and see if you're registered there. This is real. The last two elections, the coordinators actually had iPads and were giving people information about whether or not they were voted, whether or not they were registered, whether or not they were enrolled in a party, are you at the right polling site? And it was working quite smoothly in the various polling I go to a couple of large polling sites, So if there's 5 EDs in there, they were telling people which ED they belong to, and this was all being done. It was beautiful from an iPad, and there was no long lines, at least in the beginning and the middle of the day. Toward the end of the day, that sort of broke down, but. That was an improvement, and I asked the coordinator whether or not they had been trained to use the iPad, and I asked the naughty question, how are you looking up people's voter registration? Do you have a link to the Board of Elections computers? No. They were using advocates' websites where you could just go put somebody the name and address. Hey, yeah, let's give it up to NYPIRG. Let's give it up to ACLU. Let's give it up to NAACP, LDF. Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund, Latinos who have these on their website. They were going to those websites, inserting people's names. So that my thing is that as long as it's legal, I don't care how it's done. Let's get the job done. They were trying to serve, and they were serving. What we need, and what we talked about, is, why can't they have electronic poll booths? There's no reason they can't have electronic poll booths. except they don't want them. And maybe it will take a lawsuit, though I dare say we will be in Albany at the Court of Appeals before any judge would venture to disagree on scrapping a large part of what the Board of Elections does, even in the city of New York. And that's very simple because it is, again, the county leaders are the ones that decide who goes in where, and there's a lot of fear. And don't think that county leaders don't have some influence over judges, particularly if they want to run for election again. So it's tied in. It's not pleasant. It's nasty. It's insidious. But that's the state of the mess in New York City. But still, advocating for electronic poll booths, they've gotten as far as an iPad. Now all we need to do is move it from the hands of the coordinators onto the actual folks who are doing the inspectors, and maybe we'll get someplace.
All right, I want to check to see how we're doing on time. Perry, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I'll say very, very quickly, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When you're a litigator, everything looks like a lawsuit. So, I think I'm not here to second guess the motives of the Board of Elections or what their goals are. I think they can be partners in all of the common sense solutions that we know will make elections better in New York, or they can be an impediment. And I hope that they would be partners, right? Few people are as well positioned to identify the challenges and work out solutions than the people who do this every day. So I hope that there is a way to work cooperatively with them, but I think if there isn't, there are tools for compliance that have not been explored yet, and I think that time is coming sooner rather than later.
So let me look to the back. Do we have time for a question or two if folks in the room would like to ask a question to the panel? Okay, well, real quick. I know we're running late. I want to keep people.
I was wondering if any of you could comment in terms of why we have so many elections.
Okay.
And what can we do? Because I think that's one of the biggest issues in terms of having to look at vote turnout. We just had an election, special election, and 2% of the people came out. Mm-hmm. Most of the people didn't know that there was an election taking place. Is there anything that could comment in terms of why we have so many?
That's actually a complicated question. I mean, I think if you start at the top level, the first order question is, why do we have city elections in different years than state elections? It's interesting because there's a charter revision commission now that's looking closely at voting. And because much of the election law in the state is controlling, there's not a lot that we can do in the city. And there's a lot of innovative lawyers out there who have suggested proposals as to how the city could do early voting, for example, or no excuse absentee voting, and a lot of different legal theories on these things. But one of the larger issues is just, why do we have elections in odd numbered years while the federal and state elections are in even numbered years? There's probably nothing that would increase voter turnout more than combining all of these. That proposal is not without its drawbacks. There's something known as ballot fatigue, where there's so many races on a ballot that someone would actually just stop filling out the contest because there were too many, or they would feel like they had a lack of knowledge about them.
They dropped the magnifying glass.
There's also getting it all on one ballot.
I think the question is more like, we have a state primary in June and a congressional primary in September and a general election in November. And I think a couple of years ago, there was one more also.
Yeah, runoff.
Right. I mean, that's what people generally focus on. I mean, I was just raising this larger issue because I actually think it's not talked about, but very important. But yes, I mean, there's a June primary for the federal races. There's a September primary for the state races. And the reason because of that is the state legislature couldn't agree on how to comply with the MOVE Act at the federal level. The Senate Republicans wanted to have
military overseas voting.
Yeah, so the Republicans wanted to have the election in August, and the Democrats wanted to do it in June, and so they didn't agree. And then a court ordered the June federal election. And all of this was in response to the MOVE Act, which I'm less familiar with, but essentially it was to ensure that military and overseas voters had time to vote. So that,
maybe one or two real quick. That's a hand here. I'm an election worker for the last couple of years, and by the way, the coordinators.
Bravo. Bravo, I think.
Well, yeah, actually, I came here for a separate thing, but I was going to address the voting. My coordinators, I've had big work most of the day, and he was going back and forth. We also some lights, but addressing a lot of people that showed up. Part of the thing is that people move, and they don't have an address. I've got two sons, both in college, just out of college. A lot of their friends, same thing. They move. My older son, 4 different addresses. He went to Iowa to actually work on a congressional campaign. He's kicked out of his apartment. He's got to find another one, fill the register, whatever. My younger son's in Minneapolis, early coming back. I want them to vote there. I'm trying to get some of their friends to vote here, but they move. They move all the time. Williamsburg is probably the same thing. And a lot of people that showed up in polling places, they had moved. They didn't know that, the polling place had moved or whatever. Not an easy thing to address. So people show up, frustrated. There were some people that were really, really angry. And we tried to deal with it. The DOE wasn't much help. We got a real problem.
Technology improves some of that, right? I mean, it's yeah.
And, a lot of it, the kids don't know the laws. People don't vote all the time. I mean, some of us vote all the time. I told my kids they don't vote until they go home.
Sure, but listen, the ability to have. That's an admirable attitude, and perhaps if more parents took that, this turnout rate would be higher for 18 to 29. No health insurance if you don't vote. No, but no, if you had every poll station, you have someone who has electronically the entire voter file and can say, you're at the wrong place, or press a button and update. Yes. No, that's yes. Well, that's why you have redundancies built, right? That's why you're hopefully not relying on one device for everything, and something is hard. I mean, but this is a solution. I mean, the problem with paper is you can't update paper, right? And you can't have the entire voter file there on paper, right? So you need to have access to all those things to make sure that someone's information is up to date and accurate, to make sure that they're in the right place. These are very, very solvable problems that should be matters that.
Also, people could change their address online, because people didn't forget about it. They do that in DMV if you're in New York State. If you're coming from out of state,
it's a good thing everyone in New York City drives. I know. I think the Department of Social Services.
You need a separate panel.
I do have a response to don't come home if you don't vote. I did the reverse. Come home. Vote from your old address.
That seems like. So I'll say that seems like as good a place as any to close. But with that, I want to thank you guys for taking the time to be with us today and share your wisdom. It's a great way for us to kick off the spring. And thanks to everyone for taking the time to join us. Anita, Amy, do you have anything to close with?
So, I guess the question is, people have, we're going to open it to public testimony, if people want to give testimony to the committee, or if there's not anything, then we'll just adjourn. I just wanted to offer that opportunity. Oh, there's someone from the front. Oh, thank you. Yeah. That is that. Did you want that? That's what you want. Okay.
All right. Okay. Do I get to adjourn the meeting from up here? All right. All right. Thanks again, everyone. All right.